Just outside the town of Larvik, a monument has been erected to honour the memory of the most celebrated Norwegian of modern times. Born in Larvik 100 years ago, this was the birthplace of the Kon-Tiki man. Explorer, adventurer, writer, artist, filmmaker, and environmentalist. His greatest wish was to be remembered above all as a scientist. He was a man of great knowledge and a man of action. His name was Thor Heyerdahl.
You cannot buy ticket to paradise. You may be able to find paradise within yourself. That's the only place you can find it today.
Born in this house in 1914, the greatest influence in his early years was his mother. Strong-willed and forceful, she had no time for miracles and mysticism. His father, on the other hand, was a regular churchgoer and a pillar of Larvik society. The marriage was not a happy one, but they stayed together for the sake of the young Thor. The wonders of nature were a springboard for his imagination. Young as he was already producing images of exotic, faraway places. It was as if this rather solitary boy already had visions of what might lie ahead for him. Thor's collection of bugs and beetles, my animal house as he called them, might have exasperated his father, but not his mother. It was becoming obvious that this boy would never join his father in the brewery business. To no one's surprise, he chose to study biology and zoology at Oslo University, but already his restless imagination was leading him elsewhere. Modern life in a big city was not for him. He wanted, quite literally, to go back to nature. He'd met and fallen in love with a beautiful girl called Liv. They married, and very shortly afterwards they set out on an adventure that most people only dream about. Together they planned to start a new life in the South Seas. They were on their way to the island of Fataheva, their own personal Garden of Eden. The boat that put them ashore would disappear over the horizon beyond recall. They had told their families the experiment would last a year, but in fact they had no plans to return. They wanted to go all the way. There was work to be done and plenty to occupy their minds, but gradually as the months went by, they began to realize that they were already too late. Fataheva was part of the modern world, not isolated from it. It was time to go home. In less than a year they were back in Norway. Thor wrote a book about their experiences. It had a message for everyone. You can't buy a ticket to paradise. All you can do is find it within yourself. Heyerdahl had observed something else about Fataheva. Almost always, the prevailing wind came from the east. Was it possible that the first migrants had come from North and South America? And after that, perhaps a second wave had found a route through Asia, across the Bering Straits, to Canada, before facing the vast Pacific on their way to the islands of Polynesia. This idea would become an obsession with Thor in the years to come. Heyerdahl had recently been shown a picture of a stone head with Polynesian features. It had been found at a place called Bella Coola in British Columbia. But who would take him there?
So he came to my father's office and stood beside the globe where he explained his theories to my father. And my father loved history, so it didn't take him long to see that this was special. And we had a liner business of ships that went through the Panama Canal up through British Columbia.
Thor settled down with his family in Canada to plan a major thesis on Pacific migration. Unhappily for him, the year was 1939. Norway was invaded by the Nazis. He was still in Canada, but he signed up for duty with a special training unit called Little Norway.
I was actually the only Norwegian soldier who had the family with me.
In due course, they were due to operate as saboteurs behind the German lines. But by the time they reached their homeland, the war was all but over. As for Thor Heyerdahl, he had a family to support, but no income and no job. His next move was to try his luck in New York. But even in that city of innovation and new ideas, no one had time for a young Norwegian with some crazy theory about American Indians setting out to cross the Pacific on primitive rafts.
Well, to prove my point, I had to show that it was possible. So I decided to build a raft and start the voyage.
In the rainforests of Ecuador, he found the balsa wood logs he was looking for. The raft was built in the Peruvian port of Callao, just outside Lima.
Callao, Peru. Final preparations for a modern odyssey by 6 men on a raft. This primitive craft is to carry anthropologist Thor Heyerdahl and 5 companions 4,000 miles across the Pacific to prove a scientific theory.
The next day, the 29th of April 1947, they were alone in the Pacific, with nothing to sustain them but Thor's stubborn belief in himself.
He couldn't swim when he went on the Kon-Tiki. He couldn't even sail. But he had this question, where did the Polynesians come from? And the force of that question was so strong that he went on that raft without any experience at all, except one. The Incas had done it, the South American Indians had done it, that was his conviction. If they had done it, I can do it. There's Thor Heyerdahl for you.
For Thor Heyerdahl, this was above all a scientific voyage. The crew took daily measurements of their position, temperature, wind and speed. They gathered plankton. They even considered the possibility of drinking lymph fluid from fish. But in the eyes of the world, it would become one of the most famous sea voyages in history.
We felt as we were part of the universe. Cities and nations were not there. We were human beings, and there was our planet and the universe. It was a very, very strange feeling.
After 100 days at sea, they caught sight of some frigate birds. Land could not be far off. The very next day, there it was, an insignificant island surrounded by a reef. To avoid it was impossible. In a matter of seconds, Kon-Tiki became an inferno of foam and wreckage. Giant waves lifted her out of the ocean and wedged her firmly along the spine of the reef. The mast and sail came crashing down. The voyage was over. Miraculously, no one had been hurt. Salvaging what they could, they set off in search of dry land and human habitation. Heyerdahl wasted no time in telling the world his news. Yes, it was possible to sail across the Pacific on a primitive balsa wood raft.
Now the reason why I think is, well, this happens in 1947, 2 years after the war. Most people were tired of the war and they needed something else, something totally different. And this was an adventure that sort of stuck with the public. They were invited to the White House to shake hands with President Truman. And that picture with Truman and Heyerdahl and his crew was printed all over the world. And after this, you know, Thor Heyerdahl, he became a master of publicity.
In those bleak, post-war years of austerity, Heyerdahl's account of the adventure was exactly what the world seemed to be waiting for. For a brief period in his life, he became a rich man. It was only the scientific community that remained aloof. As far as the academic world was concerned, it had all been a bit of a prank, adding nothing of any value to the sum of human knowledge. As for the Kon-Tiki herself, the shattered remains of that famous vessel came home in triumph to a frozen Oslo fjord.
There was Knut Haugland, who was the telegraphist on the Kon-Tiki raft. He wanted to save the Kon-Tiki raft and he wanted to build a museum. So it was really his idea to get the raft to Oslo and build a museum here.
Tourists and celebrities arrived in ever-growing numbers to share in the achievement of Heyerdahl and his crew. They've done so ever since. A film was made and distributed worldwide. It won an Oscar for the best documentary of the year.
Academy of Arts and Science.
I really think we got it because it is so bad that anybody could see it was authentic. There could be no doubt this was not made in Hollywood. This was made by somebody who never shot a film before.
But of much more importance to Thor Heyerdahl, his thesis was finally published. But still the scientific community were not convinced.
So I think Thor was a kind of torch, making people discuss, and I think science is very dependent of discussions.
About this time he received a photograph in the post. It was a picture of a stone head found in the Galapagos Islands. Thor had seen very similar stone heads in South America.
So I immediately organized an expedition with one top American and one top Norwegian archaeologist, and went with equipment and all that was needed for a major expedition.
The head showed up to be a falsum, completely new.
Well, that was a terrible disappointment. I can hardly describe how bad it felt to have brought two professional archaeologists out there just to look at something that a German settler had made to entertain his own children.
The incident did nothing to advance Thor's bid to be taken seriously as a scientist and a historian.
Then Arne Skjølsvold said, well, let's do archaeological excavations. And I found a lot of pottery and ceramics showing that it must have been people from South America, Ecuador or Peru coming out to the Galapagos Island.
From what looked like a major blunder, Thor and his team did their best to build up a reputation for historical and scientific accuracy.
But again, the result was silenced completely. And the critics some of the critics commenting this said, well, it's not inhabited just by a Peruvian or Ecuadorian fishermen who had brought with them some pottery. But my God, the pottery was of Inca period, and the fishermen of modern times, Peru and Ecuador, didn't use pottery from the Inca period. So that's nonsense.
Now there was another major crisis in Thor's life. He and Liv were drifting apart. There was a new lady at his side. Her name was Yvonne. Thor Heyerdahl's next great venture in the Pacific would take him to Easter Island, the most isolated piece of land on Earth, and one of the most mysterious. With him came his newly married second wife and his grown-up son.
I was 17, and then coming to an island on the opposite side of the globe, it was extremely exciting. Everything was fascinating, and everything I did was the first time I ever did it. So I have very pleasant memories of that year.
On the lower slopes of an extinct volcano, there were dozens of huge stone statues. Nothing like them had been found anywhere else in the South Pacific. In a frenzy of demonic activity, they must have been carved out of the solid rock hundreds of years ago.
Well, you know that before I launched the theory that the first migration came from South America, it was a common belief that they came from Asia, and then this would be the last island populated, and no time for soil to accumulate, so there would be nothing to dig for. I had the opposite view, that they came from South America. This was the first island populated, and thus there would be a lot of soil. Yes.
At the base of one of the statues, a three-masted ship was revealed. Perhaps the islanders had once seen the real thing. What had caused this frenzy of activity all those years ago?
I've lived 1 year among the Polynesians in the Marquesas Islands, and I knew that this is not the kind of work they would do. They would not have anybody telling them to work like slaves in masses, So I felt very strongly, here we have some branch of the great prehistoric civilizations of the world. And I felt that way ever since.
Later, one of the archaeologists caught sight of a large rock resting on its side. When it was raised up, he realized it was actually a statue on its knees, quite unlike all the others on the island. Thor was reminded of a similar figure he'd seen outside Bolivia's National Museum.
You see this kneeling statue brought from Tiahuanaco to La Paz has the same strange kneeling pose with hands on the knees and the same physiognomy with the goatee beard and the eyebrows ending in big sagging pouches under the eyes. And then you find that we have now 3 on Easter Island, and there are none else in all the Pacific.
Seeds might be carried over long distances by the wind, but not stone statues. It was as if the entire population of this remote island had been gripped by some sort of religious fervour, with the carving of these huge stone statues as the principal activity. But how had they succeeded in raising and moving these monstrous giants from one part of the island to another? According to local legend, they walked of their own accord. Thor was open to any number of suggestions, but not that one. He decided to carry out some experiments of his own. Lured by the promise of a party, the Easter Islanders volunteered to try and pull one of these giant statues to its final destination without ruining it.
So we felt that, no, we knew how it could be done, but the mayor and his men said, well, but this was not the way it was done before they walked.
All his life, Thor had always been a great believer in the value of oral history, but this was one theory too many. It would remain untested for many years. By now, Thor's personal finances were in a poor state. They were difficult days. All that he hated about the modern world, the testing of nuclear weapons, the Cold War, and the arms race, all seemed to be crowding in. Then the clouds lifted. Aku Aku became a bestseller. But in spite of this, Thor had made up his mind to leave Norway.
One of the reasons he left was that his fellow Norwegian scientists criticized him for his research, and it was alleged by a couple of anthropologists that he sort of put the Kon-Tiki on that reef on purpose, which of course is not true. And that really made him angry, and that was, he was never recognized in Norway by the scientists at that time. But and also in the public, he was much more recognized in like Sweden, in England, in the United States, France, Germany, than in Norway. But there was also a tax evasion motive here. In those days, in the 50s, he was a rich man from selling all his books. And the government took a lot of that money in taxes.
He decided to take his family to a small town in the northwest of Italy called Colomacare. Here, away from the constant glare of publicity, he would rediscover the pleasures of rural life, produce his own wine, and raise his own livestock. It was not to be. One day, he read an article in the magazine American Antiquity listing the cultural similarities shared by the Mediterranean region and parts of South America. All his old restlessness came rushing back. Was it possible that early man had crossed the Atlantic Ocean long before Christopher Columbus? In the Cairo Museum, he saw a display of wooden boats seen long ago on the waters of the Nile. But the open ocean was a very different matter. Was it possible that our distant ancestors had used reeds to build ocean-going vessels, allowing the water to simply wash through? Thor chose to build his reed ship beneath the pyramids at Giza, a typical Heyerdahl location. Good publicity for the Egyptian government and good publicity for his own new venture. Nothing less than the crossing of the Atlantic on a bundle of reeds.
I think the main trouble we had were all the camel drivers that came, and the camels were feeding from the boat. I mean, we tried to stop them by feeding them outside, but it happened twice that they took a good bite out of the bow of the ship.
The spectacle resembled a scene from an epic Hollywood film. With the whole world watching, Thor Heyerdahl was in his element. The ship was to be named Ra, in honor of the sun god. From the banks of the Nile, she would travel by sea to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. This time, the crew would not be all Scandinavian. He wanted them to be truly international.
I had one American, one Soviet Russian, and I had one black man and one yellow and European, one Arab and one Jew. I mixed it as much as possible in the space we had.
The only member of the crew with any sailing experience was the American, Norman Baker.
As we began to talk about it, as he began to explain the logic of it, why he thought these boats could have made it, why I began to be convinced, little by little, that after 5 hours, I thought, I do believe these boats did make it across the Atlantic, and I would love to try.
Thor's wife Yvonne was there, no doubt wondering like everyone else if they would ever be seen again.
I was responsible for the experiment. To me, it was a scientific experiment. This could be an experiment not only into the past, but also into the future. I felt that in reality, we are on this planet living just like on a raft. We are all together and we will sink and float together.
They were on their way. For the second time in his life, Thor put his trust in his men, his ship, and his vision.
Yes, he had a vision. If he hadn't had, there would have been no trips at all.
But after 7 weeks at sea, Ra was little more than a floating haystack. The danger of losing a man overboard was growing day by day.
So I said, let us cut it off. We have the answer.
Hello, Shenandoah. Hello, Shenandoah. This is Ra. This is Ra.
I realized that we had proven our point. The papyrus was floating. It was the ropes that had busted. But on the other hand, I noticed that to most people, including my own crew, it was the miles that were missing, getting there, that counted, and not the miles behind us. So I really felt that to do it correct, I had to do it all over again with the experience we had.
Je vous baptiserai à deux et je vous souhaite plein succès.
In all his long career, nothing better illustrates Thor's stubborn determination than the launch of Ra 2 a year later. She was several meters shorter than Ra 1 and much more rigid.
But Ra 2 was too small and overloaded, and she lost buoyancy very rapidly.
After the crew had reported serious oil pollution on the first voyage, this time the United Nations asked them to carry out daily observations.
We collected oil clots 43 days out of the 57 the trip took. I couldn't say exactly how many days we would have collected if we'd done the same on the first trip. But certainly the ocean was in a terrible state, which was confirmed later when both the United States and the Soviet Union sent out research vessels to double-check our observations.
And that was in the period when we were cleaning our tankers on the way empty back to the Middle East. And we hoisted it out of the tanks up on deck and threw it overboard. And these lumps formed. And so he found amazing amounts. And of course there were amazing amounts. And it took a long time to sink.
And we had written reports about oil floating the surface, dissolved in the water masses, sedimented on the bottom. Nobody paid any attention. But then here comes my father with an oil lamp on his toothbrush. Ha! Then the world wakes up.
As Ra-2 approached the island of Barbados, several planes flew overhead, dipping their wings. This was a triumph the world had been waiting for. Thor Heyerdahl had demonstrated that it was possible to cross the Atlantic, hundreds of years before Christopher Columbus. A firm believer in world government, Heyerdahl came home determined to play his part in cleaning up the planet, beginning with the world's oceans.
The first person to really look at the state of our oceans and say, watch out, man, you're destroying our oceans.
He used his well-known name in the fight for the environment.
He was even invited to the Congress of the United States in their hearings.
But Thor Heyerdahl's fascination with the sea was altogether more profound.
Whether we trust the Bible or we believe in science, that life on this planet started in the ocean, and it started on this planet because it's the only one in our solar system that has an ocean. All these civilizations started at the same time man began to navigate, although we know that men have been living on this planet as a species, Homo sapiens, for at least 2 million years. But he was a real land animal until he collected enough floating reeds to build primitive rafts that developed gradually into the first reed ships.
But where did they live, these early people? Many believe they were Sumerians, ancestors of the marsh Arabs of today.
Where the Tigris River and the Euphrates River meet, and where they join, this little delta is called the Garden of Eden.
This was another part of the world where the building of reed ships dated back for thousands of years.
I was very much impressed by the marsh Arabs. I thought it was an exceptional people, and I had a feeling that here I met an eternal civilization. They were living in harmony with nature and from nature without destroying nature, and they lived the way they did, and they lived well for at least 5,000 years.
Okay, this is fine. Guys, tell them to start cutting. They can start.
We had done something we'd never done before. We had even taken account of the correct month to cut the reeds. Ra-1 and Ra-2 absorbed a lot of water because we'd cut in the wrong season. Nobody could tell us. But the marsh Arabs had said if you want to float for a year or two, you have to cut it in August.
From Lake Titicaca in far-off Bolivia, Heyerdahl brought in Aymara Indians, in his eyes the world's best builders of reed boats. At first, they were doubtful about using the local Berdi reeds, so a model was constructed to show everyone what the finished vessel would look like. Nothing like it had been seen on the two great rivers of Arabia for hundreds of years.
Since the bundles were actually built by the marsh Arabs, the Aymara Indians were just dictating how to tie the bundles together. It worked out beautifully.
Invigorated by the thoughts racing through his head, Thor was in his element. Did the world's oldest civilizations have a common source? If so, where was it to be found? If he could unlock that mystery of mysteries, what knowledge and understanding might flow from it for the benefit of all mankind.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we have come to the moment of the departure from the Republic of Iraq with the Verdi ship Tigris.
For the fourth time in his life, Thor Heyerdahl was at the helm of his own ship, ready to fulfill his destiny. The plan was a straightforward one. With the help of the prevailing wind, they would sail right down the Persian Gulf and into the Indian Ocean. But where was the prevailing wind? For several days, Tigris appeared to make very little progress at all. The climate itself was playing tricks with them.
What is happening? Man is cutting down the tropical forests in India and Indonesia, and it is in the rainy season the forest that create the direction of the wind. That we did not have the monsoon wind and correct current. A single day when we sailed with the reed ship from India to Africa in '77.
One more time, let's go! Let's go!
Day after day, they had shifting or contrary winds. Another serious hazard was the Straits of Hormuz, the world's busiest shipping lane.
It could not maneuver as much as it had to, or that he hoped it would, to navigate in and out of the big freighters that were, you know.
They didn't see us on the radar, and we were unable to move out of the way quickly without putting the oars into the water.
In such a harsh environment, a reed ship seemed utterly out of place. And now, for the first time in his seafaring life, Thor Heyerdahl met with a hostile reception.
What would be your next port after this? Are you intending to touch another port? Or
we just want to go as long as the vessel will float and see.
Yeah,
it's testing a primitive type of vessel to see how long it will float and where it's likely that ancient people could have traveled.
You can bring up the sail.
But in spite of all the setbacks, Thor still felt he was making progress. Archaeological research had been taking place on the Arabian Peninsula for many years. A study of ancient Sumerian scripts had identified first Dilmun and then Makan. Now there was a reference to a third region, Meluha. Was the ancient world about to reveal its secrets? On one point, Thor was quite clear.
We start to think all the time that you have three civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. And we wonder, how did they have contact? Well, the sea tied them together. It didn't split them apart, it tied them together.
Think of it. People thought that it would take centuries to walk while they were doing it in months.
I have suggested that we set a course straight for the Gulf of Aden, Egypt, and the inner corner of the Mediterranean world.
As they approached, a number of military aircraft appeared overhead, a reminder that this part of the world had recently become a war zone. Tigris was no threat to anyone, an envoy of peace if ever there was one. But the warring factions in the region were in no mood to listen. The Gulf of Aden was closed to them on both sides, whatever course they might choose. The tiny state of Djibouti would offer them a haven, but even North Yemen notified them that Tigris would be denied access to their coastal waters.
I'm sure it was frustrating. I mean, really frustrating for him. And for that, there was nothing anybody could do. Nothing anybody could do.
In Djibouti harbour, Thor sat alone with his thoughts. All the hope and exhilaration of the past few weeks had ebbed away. Even his most immediate aim, A voyage from the mouth of the Tigris River to the mouth of the Nile was now out of the question. The flags of all the nations, so proudly displayed from the masthead as a symbol of harmony, were now folded away. Thor's mind was made up. Tigris might have made her last voyage, but she was not going to end her days rotting in the polluted waters of some foreign harbour. The crew assembled on shore for a final farewell.
It looks beautiful. And with the continent of Africa behind it. Take off your hat.
He decided to send a message to the Secretary-General of the United Nations. Today we are burning our proud ship as a protest against inhuman elements in this world of ours. Our planet is larger than the bundle of reeds that bore us across the sea, but still small enough to risk the same threats unless we acknowledge that there's a desperate need to save ourselves and our common civilization from what we human beings are turning into a sinking ship.
There was still a lot of life in that ship, a lot of life.
I believe him at that point. He wanted really to protest this war. Poor people on every side, nations, they were supported by the Soviet Union and the United States. That would send them heavy weaponry so they could kill each other, so to speak. And he wanted to have those great power to stop this. That is why he puts this Tigris on fire. And I perfectly believe him. Taking his engagement in the peace process in general, he was a firm believer in the United Nations, for instance.
He hoped that he would go around the south of Africa, and indeed even mentioned crossing the Atlantic and getting to Yucatan.
To show there was a connection between the culture of the old Mesopotamia and the old cultures in Mexico and Peru. That was his goal. He never mentioned it publicly.
It was an experiment that would explore what the ancient Phoenicians may have done.
He thought he could sail, go against the wind with it, which they couldn't.
Thor Heyerdahl was coming home. Not to Norway, where his burning of Tigris had a mixed reception, but to his Italian house in Colomacere. Difficult days lay ahead. His marriage to Yvonne was over, and a painful divorce was in progress. But with the general public, he was as popular as ever.
Let's meet archaeologist, anthropologist and explorer, Thor Heyerdahl.
Ladies and gentlemen, Thor Heyerdahl.
Do you consider yourself a lucky person in that your horoscope has ever come true?
I consider myself a lucky person, yes. I do.
But in truth, it wasn't a lucky period for Thor Heyerdahl. His Tigris book was reasonably well received, but sales were disappointing. Even his life in Italy, once so happy, was not the same without a companion. But as so often in Thor's life, it was the prospect of fresh discoveries that lifted his spirits. Inside his head there was still an unsolved problem. What made the Easter Island statues walk? In 1986, he was back on the island. Here of all places, the name of Heyerdahl was still revered.
Till today, after almost 50 years, nobody has been able to do what Thor did. We can agree or not agree, but his collaboration to show the island in a different way and to bring different science from different countries. And it's make these people to continue work in the future. So no matter from where, the influence of Thor till today is putting the island in the map.
Heyerdahl had never forgotten what he'd been told 30 years before. The words kept ringing in his ears. The statues walked. A young Czech scientist named Pavel had also been preoccupied with the same problem. Now the two men teamed up for a practical experiment. For the first time in several centuries, an Easter Island statue was walking again. But then something happened that threatened to turn all Thor Heyerdahl's migration theories upside down. In the course of an excavation, they found the bones of a Polynesian rat. It must have travelled with migrants arriving from the west.
And Thor, he got completely pale like a paper. And he didn't say a word. I remember it as it should be 1 minute ago. And then he went up and left the room. And Arne said to me, "No, what the hell, no, what no?" And then I said, "Well, Arne, I think tomorrow Thor will be back and then he have found some solution for that problem."
And he was right. Next morning, Thor had the answer.
Well, I found out that instead of going directly from Polynesia to Easter Island, those guys then went up through north into down British Columbia, the coast of California, and then out to Easter Island. So then he turned the whole problem upside down. So then he was happy again.
No one can plan his whole life in advance. Events play a part. It's only later that a pattern emerges. These are the pyramids of Tucumay in northern Peru. Thor was here to learn what he could about the most extensive display of ancient man-made structures in the southern hemisphere. With funds from the Kon-Tiki Museum in Oslo, Thor managed to ensure there would be no more raids on this priceless source of historic information.
Muchas gracias a él y a todos los amigos que ayudaron a que el proyecto de Tucumay sea una realidad y que ahora tengamos este museo maravilloso que le da trabajo a la comunidad actual, lo que él siempre quiso, que la gente viviera mejor, que la gente tuviera mejores oportunidades en su vida, más trabajo, y este museo lo consigue, y es su obra. Eso es.
As the pyramids gave up their secrets, an astonishing collection of bones, murals, and pottery was uncovered. Some of it pointing to a direct link with Easter Island. There were well-preserved mummies with feather adornments and silver earplugs still in place.
And one relief showing balsa rafts, ships, seagoing ships with birdmen, different symbols, only found on the Easter Island before that. So when Thor found this stuff in Tucumay, it was a big, great scientific victory for him.
But at a special conference held later in Wyoming, Thor and his team were in for a big surprise.
So I made that report to the audience, and everybody that had made a speech before me got applause. When I finished showing the picture from Tucumay, you can hear the needle fall on the floor. It was nothing, no reaction, no applause, no question, no nothing. Absolutely nothing. But after I made my speech, during the lunch, one American archaeologist from Los Angeles, University of California, came over to me and said, "Tell me honestly, Øystein, the picture you showed me or the audience of the relief in Tukumi, is it so that you found it, or has Thor made it himself?" So I was so disappointed when I heard this. What did people think about Thor?
But it has become a fashion within North American and British archaeology to disregard Heyerdahl and actually to present this open resistance of some kind. I don't approve of it. I think as scientists we should be open-minded and listen to everyone who has something to contribute, and obviously he does. I mean, he knows a lot more about sea and wind currents than anybody else I can think of, and that relates to this whole issue.
I'm finished discussing it with you.
Well, somebody must meet me and discuss here, because I go to one congress after another, and everybody, they agree. But as soon as I'm away, they go to National Geographic magazine or archaeology,
they just don't want to keep
and they
arguing
say,
about it.
And they say that my theory is like von Däniken.
How do you feel about being accused of being stubborn and narrow-minded?
Well, I've been used to it. If I shall be serious, some people have told me one thing. No? They have said that if it hadn't been for all these people who had bawled you out, nobody would care about who you were, nobody would care about where the Polynesians came from. So they said you should be more grateful to these people than to all those who agree with you but don't get press, because if somebody goes to a newspaper and say that we agree with Heyerdahl, nobody would print it. But if you have some argument against, they print it. But when you want to meet them, they never show up. They run away, as happened yesterday.
Yeah, that's it.
Let's you and I agree to talk when there's not a camera over your shoulder.
Okay.
Thor made the speech for the people of Laramie, not for the academia. And the auditorium was completely full.
Any idiot, a monkey, we had monkeys on board, can cross any ocean on a reed boat when you know how to build it.
My father was just as much an artist as he was a scientist. He showed that through his writings, through his filmings, drawings, and the combination between the curiosity of a scientist and the imagination of an artist made him, say, jump to conclusions. He saw this is the way it must be.
In Thor's mind, pyramids were gradually taking the place of migration routes. A few months later, he was in the Canary Isles.
I've now been here 18 times to look at these pyramids and to start the projects together with Fred Olsen, who bought the land, a Norwegian ship owner.
As the project developed, it became a memorial to Thor Heyerdahl rather than the builders of the pyramids. His sculpted head takes pride of place in front of a replica of Ra II. Other sections of the museum are devoted to Easter Island. In Fred Olsen's opinion, the story is far from over.
I think that there's more to be had. There's more to be found that might find that his notions about these early civilizers, there might be a lot more in it than we know now. And so the future will tell.
With his new wife, Jacqueline, Thor found a charming house not far from the pyramids. Together with a friend, he began work on a new book about Odin, a legendary king of ancient Norse mythology. According to the legendary Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson, Odin possessed an 8-legged horse and 2 ravens that brought him news from the outside world. He'd also traded in one of his eyes in exchange for the gift of wisdom. Snorri claimed that Odin was an actual king who ruled in the Asov region near the Black Sea. He was forced to flee from the advancing Romans and eventually settled in Scandinavia. Could Snorri be trusted, or was he inventing his own fairy tales?
The book is written by Per and me, asking the experts with modern telecommunication, internet, and with all my contacts with scientific academies and universities.
If Odin was indeed a real person, the proof must lie buried in the Azov region in southern Russia.
If we find that there is evidence to take Snorri seriously, okay, then that's a scientific importance. If we find anything to contradict it, that is equally important.
Heyerdahl and his team continued to search for any links between myth and traditional history.
When we read the Bible and we read the Greek mythologies, we now know from archaeological research that many of the stories in the Bible and in the Greek mythologies, they have foundations in historical facts and in historical periods. And why should it be different with the Odin and the other religions?
Was it possible that Odin had led his people right across Russia, using rivers and waterways, to take his place in the unfolding saga of Scandinavia? But now Thor had a much more serious problem to face. In the course of a routine checkup, his doctors discovered a tumour just below his left eye, which required immediate surgery. For a time he felt better and finished his book on Odin, but the cancer returned. The search for Odin was published in 2002. It triggered strong reactions, especially at his old university in Oslo. But he still had the energy to take on his accusers.
Get them irritated. Maybe some of what I say is wrong, maybe. But I know some of what they say is wrong also. And all my life I've proven that dogmas, be aware of dogma, because if everybody agrees, if everybody starts to agree with myself, then I'd be worried.
As an honorary doctor, Thor was invited to give a lecture about his book on Odin. But the younger generation of academics showed neither respect nor courtesy towards the old giant. They launched a verbal attack on him that was well prepared and well organized. They wanted to discredit his theories and methods once and for all. In fact, they made it clear they didn't consider his work as pure science at all. Their condescending and hostile tone was embarrassing for the audience. As for Thor, he was confronted by a barrage of questions and quotations that were not relevant to his book or his lecture.
Fortsett motstanden, men gjør det med å forsøke å forske selv, og ikke bare med å forhindre andre.
Invited to take part in a seminar, he felt he'd been lured into an ambush. 3 days later, he and Jacqueline travelled back to Tenerife. Thor Heyerdahl would never see his homeland again.
He would like to be remembered for his science. He would not like to be remembered as an adventurer.
He thought different from all other scientists.
I think he would have liked to be remembered as a man uniting the world.
But if he has a legacy, I hope it is to inspire everybody else to really look around them and take care of the planet that we are in the process of destroying.